Mr. B with your Tuesday, May 19th lesson. We are on lesson 3 of our water system, so we're going to do a little bit of a throwback. You've probably talked about this previously in other grades. We're just going to go a little bit, do a little bit of a review on this topic, and there will be a quick little worksheet for you guys to finish up afterwards. For lesson 3, we are going to be talking about the water system. So, last class we talked about how water was distributed, and when I say that, I mean how we have 97% of it is salt water, 3% is fresh water, and then like how that fresh water is broken down into frozen versus not frozen, groundwater, and stuff like that. That was our previous lesson. So, water is always on the move, again, and that's why we are talking about the water cycle, because it goes through a routine pattern of being water, then water vapor, then a cloud, and like all that stuff that you remember from grade like 3 or 4 science kind of thing. So far we've only talked about like the water part of it. So like from our fluids unit to now, we've really only talked about water as being water, a liquid. And in some other units we've talked about like how it can change states, talking back to grade 7 and how we go through different states of matter. Now we're going to sort of combine all of those teachings and talk about the water cycle as a whole. And then I have a definition for you down here of the water cycle. So the cycle of processes by which water circulates between the Earth's oceans, atmosphere, then back on land, and it has precipitation and going down into rivers and streams. This is a very scientific definition. Basically, it's water's life cycle and how it always repeats. So it starts off as water, it gets hot, it evaporates, it turns into water vapors, it settles down into clouds, those clouds rain, that rain hits the ground, it ends up being in rivers or streams, those rivers or streams leads to oceans, that water evaporates, and it just goes through an entire life cycle consistently, and it just keeps moving and moving and always changing. So, with the definitions, again, some of these will come from previous units. We touched on some of them in our very first lesson where we were doing the textbook glossary word search. The water on Earth travels around 3 parts of the Earth. So this would have been briefly touched on in our Earth's crust unit, as well as way back in grade 6 when we were talking about ecosystems and stuff like that in the different parts. Actually, that we even talked about that again in grade 7. So we've got the hydrosphere, which encompasses all of the water on Earth. We have the atmosphere, which is like the air environment on our Earth, which is where some of the Earth's water is found here. This is the environment surrounding the Earth, so the air. And then the final one is the lithosphere, which is like the rocky Earth parts, like the continents and stuff like that. Where some water soaks and seeps and flows into the Earth's lithosphere, which is solid, rocky ground of the Earth's crust. So when we talked about groundwater previously, that is found in the lithosphere. That's just like the all-encompassing term for rocky, solid parts of the Earth. So those are our 3 parts of the Earth that the water makes a constant travel through. And so those are just 3 more definitions that we need for this topic anyway. This is a picture of the water cycle, so it gives you some of the terms that we will be using, and as you can see here from our previous lesson, we have groundwater here, so just under the Earth's surface, we've got ocean water, we've got a river leading through there, we've got a lake up here, we've got the snowy, rocky parts up here. The runoff is just basically the water flowing down to the ocean. That is what the runoff is. And then we've got our processes. So we've got evaporation, which is the water getting extra energy and changing into a solid. We've got the condensation here, where the water is starting to slow down again and the air is starting to become a solid again, which is why we have a cloud. We've got the rain, which is, again, liquid water, or it could be snow, which is more solid water, hitting the Earth, melting and then going into the oceans and the rivers and then flowing back down to the largest body of water, whether that's a lake, an ocean, or whatever. This is the whole process of the water cycle. And with the assignment, you'll get a better look at that. In order for water to change states, a temperature change must occur, which is adding or removing energy from the water. So when we add energy, it turns into air. When we remove energy, it turns into a solid. Ice is our example. This either involves adding heat energy or removing that. So what we will do here, this just explains the assignment, which I will go over with you guys now. So the water cycle reading mainly focuses on the change of state as well as some of the processes it goes through in the water cycle. So here, the first part of the reading is the changing of states. So we've got melting, sublimation, evaporation, condensation, deposition, and then freezing. I won't go into too much detail on those because I want you guys to get those from the reading. Then changing states in the water cycle does a little bit more information there. And it's just got an extra little chunk of information here for you guys to be reading. It goes through in detail the water cycle and the processes that it goes through. So the final part is you will have to have the reading. And then from that reading and the PowerPoint, you will be able to answer the questions on these 2 pages. So in this case, the first page is it gives you the terms from the reading, so that melting, sublimation, evaporation, etc. So changing of state, what it wants you to do here is it wants you to insert its original state. So we'll do melting together as an example. So for melting, it was a solid. So you can say solid because it's asking for the state. It's not asking for what version of water it is. But so we would say a solid. And when something melts, energy is added. So it turns from a solid to its new state of a liquid. And again, the next section is heat being added or taken away? Well, since we're melting and going from a solid to a liquid, we are adding heat energy. So heat energy is being added. Now, this section here where it does ask you for an example, if you want to go above and beyond, you can give me an example. So in this case, melting would be ice turning into water. That is my example there. If you want to give me an example, awesome, you can. If you don't want to, don't feel it necessary to include that. You don't have to give me an example as long as you are giving me the first 2 sections of the column. That's all I'm looking for this question. The next question is using the space below, identify what the water cycle is. So identify each step in the water cycle. So what you're going to want to do for that is come back up and read this section here. So starting here and reading through to here, that will give you the information that you need to include for this final part. Again, with the water cycle, you're probably going to want to include at least 4 to 5 sentences to kind of summarize what it is and identify the steps. But it shouldn't be any more than that. If you want to add more detail, great. But again, just give me the basic overview of the water cycle. I'm not looking for anything more. This section here is just for extra writing if you need more room. Don't feel like you have to use it. It's just there if you need it, but it's not necessary for you to write this much information unless you absolutely need to, or like me, your writing is messy and you need the extra space. Finally here, much like on the example that I gave in the PowerPoint, you're going to draw arrows to represent the various parts of the water cycle. So again, that's talking about the runoff, that's talking about evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and those steps. So here you're really just using arrows and then these steps to mark. So you would probably have, if this is the ocean or if this is the lake, you would have an arrow going up to the sky to represent evaporation. Then you're going to have another arrow representing that air turning into the clouds. What step is that? I won't give them all away, but you can look back at the PowerPoint and find most of the answers that you will need to answer this section of the question. And that's all that you guys will have to do for today's lesson. So only a few questions and a little bit of reading that you have to do, as well as checking back on the PowerPoint if you need any other information, particularly for this one, because I have a picture of the water cycle on the PowerPoint, so that would be helpful for you here. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out. I hope you had an awesome long weekend, and I will see you guys again on Thursday.